I believe that we should legalise drugs. Everything the NHS does is decided by government bureaucrats that often do not know what they're doing.
Scrap the triple lock?
Scrap the triple lock, absolutely, scrap the triple lock.
That is almost kind of the scam.
That's not privatisation.
That is a scam.
That's not privatisation though, Harry. We talk about the NHS as though it is some kind of sacred cow. I don't think the NHS should exist.
Created by Make It Common, each episode brings together two people with different perspectives. They're given a series of statements and must decide whether they agree or disagree. Once they choose their side, they go head-to-head, defending their views and challenging each other. Real opinions, real conversations, no scripts. This is The Other Side.
Hey, how you doing?
Hello!
Hi, you alright? Good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
Yeah.
My name is Reem Ibrahim. I am 23 years old and I work in economic policy.
Hello, my name is Harry. I'm 25 years old and I am a college lecturer and content creator on TikTok.
Statement number 1. The Conservative Party understands how the UK works better than the Labour Party.
I'm going to go with a soft agree.
I'm going to go with I'm going to disagree. Let's go from there. Why do you softly agree?
Well, I think that the Conservative Party took this country from bad and the Labour Party took over and took it to worse. I mean, what we saw
From which period?
Well, we're talking about the last decade or so. Although I suppose we could talk about both parties since they were founded, depending on which period of history you're looking at. I do think that generally speaking, what we've seen is the Conservative Party have an instinct to be generally lower taxes, smaller government, encouraging businesses to succeed and ultimately allowing people to keep more of their own money. And I do come from the viewpoint that people can spend their own money better than governments can. The Labour Party, though, have effectively inherited a pretty bad and dire situation. I mean, if we're looking at the last 14 years of Conservative government, where we had the highest tax burden since the Second World War, then the Labour government have taken this into the highest tax burden in British history. I mean, it's I think, sort of taking a situation from bad to worse, the regulations that we've been experiencing, the fact that businesses have been constrained so significantly, and ultimately, we see, huge amounts of people in this country now leaving. I mean, migration is going down because a lot of people are saying, actually, Britain is not a place for me to succeed. So I would say the reason why I said soft agree is that I think that, generally speaking, yes, the Conservative Party have done a better job, but not by much. But
then it's interesting when you talk about migration, for example, so net migration reached 800,000 in 2023. The British public, if you go by what the media are saying, if you look on social media, clearly that was not a popular thing.
No.
So does that mean that the Conservative Party actually understand how the British people feel? I mean, I'm all for migration. I know you're all for migration. But clearly that doesn't perhaps not suggest it. And then when we look at austerity, for example, between 2010 to 2024, though I'd argue it's still continuing under this Labour government, where we saw local authorities having their budgets cut whilst being expected to provide the same standard of service. And that's never going to work because with local authorities, as you'll know, they have statutory services and non-statutory services.
A lot of it's adult social care.
Yeah, so exactly. When you look at how much £100 of your council tax is being spent on statutory service, I mean, most of it is going towards adult social care, which is obviously a good thing. And then the lower amounts aren't getting it. I mean, I think the Conservative Party clearly, when they inherited the government, the coalition government came in 2010, the idea that the country was a shit show. Sorry, can I swear? Yeah. The idea that the country was a shit show because, there were too many public libraries is just a complete lie. No, that isn't true.
And you are right in terms of the way in which we look at government spending. Austerity, I think, has been overplayed to the position where we're talking about significant reductions in the size of the state. So I think this is basically the difference in the approach that the American government did with Doge, where they basically didn't reduce what the government does, but they just slashed public spending, basically fired a bunch of civil servants.
Well, inevitably what happens is where you
and Javier Milei in Argentina, where they've actually reduced what the state does. Now, with austerity, we reduced public spending by about 0.9%. I mean, it really wasn't very much in the grand scheme of things, but the government didn't change what the role of the state is. And so, as you've just said, we had, reductions in public spending, but still the expectation that we deliver the same services. So what you ended up having is ambulances not turning up because the day-to-day spending had reduced. So from my perspective, I think what we need to be doing is actually looking at what the government does and saying, where can we make cuts that are genuinely going to be affordable? I think we cannot have a conversation about like sustainable public finances without talking about pensions. I mean, young people
Scrap
the triple lock. Absolutely,
Yeah.
Scrap the triple lock. We need to scrap the triple lock on pensions, because what is currently happening is the government are paying for, well, taxpayers are paying for pensions for millionaires and extraordinarily expensive healthcare systems, and yet at the same time we will never get it. Like, we're both Gen Z, right?
Yeah.
We're never going to get a state pension.
Yeah.
And 25% of pensioners are millionaires. I think that's a very clear case.
But with that stat, doesn't that include the price of their property, which
does.
obviously has skyrocketed in years? So in terms of assets, they may be quite wealthy, but in terms of actual cash, it's a whole different story.
That's definitely true.
I think it's interesting with pensions, though, that I mean, maybe I'm starting to change my mind on this statement, because it's very clear the Conservative Party do understand the country, where they know that pensioners make this country go round.
And they vote.
I mean, yeah, we saw like when Labour cut a winter fuel allowance for all pensioners, which wasn't something that I agreed with. I personally don't care if a pensioner is receiving money to heat the home. I would like it to be for other generations as well, of course.
Well, but obviously it wasn't targeted, right? I mean, again,
but then means testing, this is the thing, we've had both the Conservative government and Labour governments, particularly under Blair, for example, obsessed with means testing. And means testing will never work, because where you are cutting money in one area, you end up spending it in another.
I don't think that's the case with everything, and I do think pensions should be means tested in my view. I mean, the idea that somebody like Lord Alan Sugar, who is a multi-millionaire, is in receipt of a taxpayer-funded benefit, I think is absolutely absurd.
So you're not a fan of universalism? You don't think
No, I don't. Well, I think that the problem is, when you're looking at pensions specifically, I mean, but the amount we spend on the state pension is absolutely
It's where most of the welfare budget goes.
It's
what's insane when people think it's all going to like PIP and...
No, the majority of the welfare budget goes on pensions. Yeah. And it's insane that it's the wealthiest demographic in the country and we're spending more and more money on them. Again, looking at Argentina, I think is a really good example, because Javier Milei, when he came in, one of the biggest things he did was look at the state pension and actually where we can make those reductions. So, look, I mean, we're going to see tax rises again this year. We're going to see tax rises again next year and the year after and the year after.
It's interesting you mentioned Argentina, though, because how much did the United States government bail out Argentina?
Enormous amounts.
40 billion? Yeah, so clearly it wasn't doing that. It wasn't doing that well then, was it?
What it should have, what they did do is, the point I'm making, what they did do is they've reduced the size of the state in terms of looking at pensions.
But has that actually benefited the people?
Absolutely.
Because from my understanding, they're not happy.
They are. I mean, the poverty rate has declined. The fact that in the midterms, Javier Milei, his party won, they did incredibly well. And I think that was a sort of, at least politically, a test to show that you can reduce the size of the state in a meaningful way and reduce taxes in a way that is not going to be hurting the most vulnerable in that country, but actually doing the opposite, helping those people. And I do think that the best way we alleviate poverty is free market. It's capitalism. It's the way in which we have competitive businesses that are able to make people, allow people to have choices and freedom in an economy. And we've seen the global poverty rate decline as a result of that.
Statement number 2. The government has a responsibility to reduce inequality, even if it limits individual freedom.
Disagree.
I'd say slightly disagree, yeah. Why do you disagree?
I think that inequality as a measure is not useful, because I think this was a quote from Margaret Thatcher in the House of Commons, where she said, often the left would rather the poor were poorer so long as the rich are less rich. And the idea being that if you only care about the gap between the wealthy and the poor, then you don't actually care about the genuine living standards of the most vulnerable. I think the best way we should look at things is actually saying what the state should do is have a genuine sort of safety net. There is a minimum standard level. We will not let anybody starve. We will not let people, sort of live on the streets, be homeless. If you have lost your job, there is a safety net.
UBI then, universal basic income.
Well, a lot of libertarians are supportive of universal basic income because it's, the bureaucracy. I suppose this goes back to our earlier question about means testing, right?
Of course, yeah.
It can be less bureaucratic when you don't do that. And I think individual liberty is the foundation of what it means to be human. I mean, I think that the idea that as human beings, we are able to live our lives and choose what we do with our own lives and with the money that we earn, and we can choose the path that allows us to flourish, I think that is so fundamental to what it means to be human. And so when it comes to talking about inequality, and predominantly we're talking about economic inequality, I think anytime we try and focus on the outcomes, we don't end up getting anywhere. What we should be looking at is how we can make everybody richer. And I do believe that a freer market, a smaller government, lower taxes, allowing people to keep more of their own money and spend it how they please is the best way to make the world a better place.
So are people in this country what's the average wage, average salary in this country?
£30,000,
£30,000.
yeah.
So when you have people who are living in deprivation, who probably aren't going to be subjected to very high taxes, how are they going to improve by having more of their money? Because they're already on the lowest tax rates possible. How does them having more in whatever minuscule amount that perhaps is going, national insurance contributions, for example, how is that little bit actually going to make a difference? I know Tesco always says that every little helps.
Every little helps.
I can't see, when the government says, oh yeah, we're going to give you like X amount off your energy bill, and look at it, it's like, yeah, that's great, that's going to go straight to my rent. It doesn't work.
The idea is that they themselves will have greater opportunities. I mean, we've seen this happen.
But then what opportunities? Because like for context, I'm a lecturer, a college lecturer. I look around the areas where some of my students are coming from. I don't see the opportunities. I worked in places like Northampton, for example, when I was doing community needs audits for the town council, and it was described as a low wage, low opportunity area. There is nothing. That's why Northampton, for example, geographically is perfect for like county lines drug trading, which is why a lot of kids in the area are recruited by dealers to move drugs. And because these families have barely any income coming in, they don't rat out the dealers.
So to be clear, we don't currently live in a capitalist free market economy. I mean, public spending as a proportion of GDP is about 45%. That means that half the economy is the government. This is far, far beyond anything I'm arguing for. And the point you made about county lines drug smuggling, I think is really fascinating because although I am what people may call on the right, or I'm libertarian, I believe that we should legalise drugs, partly because we are taking away the idea that somebody can be a criminal just because they want to sell a substance. And I do think that those that are addicted to substances should be treated as patients and not as criminals.
So you go for like the Portuguese method of dealing with drugs?
I don't think that, Portugal, I think, didn't necessarily have the right approach because they still obviously tax a lot of it, and so you still had. But
then again, that's to invest the services that are running as a result of helping people. I guess that's kind of the trade-off.
Yeah.
And I guess the aim is to make it a more legitimate business, as it were.
And it's definitely an improvement. But I think the point is, if you want the black market to move into the private sector, if you want the black market to not exist, and you have to then move it to the private sector, and you have to ensure, if you don't want criminals to be stabbing each other in order for them to be able to sell marijuana, make it legal. Where do you stand on the? So in terms of, obviously we've seen the privatisation of public services over the years, and we've seen the rising prices, and there's no accountability. There's no accountability whatsoever. The CEO depends on the sector.
So like water, for example. Do you think that water should be in the hands of a private company?
I do.
Really?
And I think what's interesting is when we're looking at privatisation processes. So with water, so why does privatisation work? Why is privatisation a good thing? It's because when you take a company into the private sector, people can make choices. So as a consumer, you can choose between competing firms, and those firms have to compete with one another to improve the services.
But with water, a lot of time that's really not the case.
That didn't happen. Partly because what we did was we had Ofwat, a government regulator, regulating the system. We've got basically Victorian plumbing in the UK, and we haven't really done very much to improve it.
Since what, 1992?
And we don't build any more reservoirs, partly because...
So clearly it hasn't worked then.
Partly because the Lib Dems keep blocking it. But also, as I've just said, we don't have competition. The reason why privatisation works is because you've got competition and choice for consumers. We don't have that in water, partly because it's very difficult to do.
But we don't have that in many public services. Look at the railways, for example. If you want to go from London to Manchester, which train do you take?
And who picks the contract? It's the government.
Well, it's the government, exactly. But this is the thing.
So we've not privatised the railways fully. The tracks are still owned by the government.
But then that is almost kind of the scam.
That's not privatisation.
That is a scam.
That's not privatisation, though, Harry, because what has happened is the government still owns the tracks, and the government picks which contract, which company is allowed to operate between London and Manchester.
So you would fully hand it over to Avanti?
And allow that...
But would that work? Because, look at the way... but this is the thing. Avanti's the only company that's actually bidding for the contract. That's why they keep winning it year on year on year, and the service just keeps getting crapper.
Yeah, because...
So clearly it's not working.
Right, because there is no competition.
But who's going to compete with them? Clearly, if there was... Given how bad Avanti have been over the years, you would think that there'd be someone who goes, oh, you tell you what, lads, let's get together, let's actually form an alternative. But that hasn't happened. Why hasn't that that happened?
Because the government are terrible at picking contracts. I mean, this is the point. You cannot call the government deciding which company is allowed to operate on which track privatisation. Because again, the point is there is no competition. Avanti aren't competing with another provider. What we should actually have is, if we did privatise the tracks, allow that company to choose what it is. That will be based on lower costs, it will be based on increased efficiencies, and of course lower train tickets.
But then where's the accountability? Because where is the accountability? Because
the accountability comes from the market. So, as a consumer, if I choose to go with Avanti and they're doing a great job, they've got a fantastic cafe on board, they are improving the services, and I choose to go there over another insert other rail company here.
But the thing is, there's never gonna be one though.
Statement number 3. The wealthy should be taxed more to reduce inequality.
Disagree.
Agree.
The top 1% already pay about 30% of all income tax. So we're already facing the highest tax burden in 70 years. We are about to enter a period of the highest taxation in British history. And what is happening is the government are increasingly crowding out the private sector, meaning that there are less jobs, there are more government spending on areas of which are crowding out. So one example I think is welfare. You know, the fact that the welfare state has increased so significantly has meant that a lot of the private initiatives in charity, in poverty alleviation, in addiction support have been crowded out by the state. When you're looking across the world, so at the IEA, the think tank I work for, we looked at about 23 OECD countries and found that the countries with lower taxes and smaller amounts of government welfare spending had higher welfare outcomes, namely countries like Switzerland, which actually have enormous private sector capacity for support for those people. But in other countries where you've got higher taxes, like Britain, and more government spending, welfare outcomes are worse. And that includes things like social inclusion, educational attainment, healthcare outcomes. Look at the amount that the government is spending. So I don't think the solution to our economic problems is more government. I think the solution is obviously, abundantly, less government and allowing people to have the power rather than government bureaucrats.
That's interesting. But it's interesting, again, you say, like, with where money's going, say, education, for example. Education now is ran by local authorities. And we touched on this earlier when we were talking about austerity. And you talked about social inclusion and stuff like that in your point as well. Because so much money is going in statutory services. You know, things like youth clubs, for example, other forms of social inclusion, leisure centres, that sort of thing. The funding isn't there, which means that that sort of inclusivity isn't able to happen. Look,
because
I'm all for
internally for government spending, which is why they should be privatised.
The solution isn't just to put it in the hands of a private company, though.
The reason why it is because consumers, and what do we mean by consumers? We mean human beings that have money, they're able to choose between different products and services. They then choose if a system is better. And I think one example of this is healthcare. Should we talk about the NHS?
Yeah, we can talk about it. Yeah.
I think what's
closest
interesting...
thing got to a religion in this country.
It is.
Yeah,
I mean, we talk about the NHS as though it is some kind of sacred cow. I don't think the NHS should exist. I mean, quite frankly, when you look at other countries across the world that have better healthcare outcomes, they are often a competitive market. And the reason why this works is, as a consumer, as a patient, you can choose where you get your healthcare from. Let's look at the Netherlands, which I believe you are originally from.
Oh, well, I'm from Tooting originally, but yeah,
In the Netherlands, you've got a competitive market system where the government does guarantee a statutory minimum package. But as a patient, you can choose where you get your healthcare from. You've got insurance providers that compete, and if one doctor does a bad job, you go to another. If one doctor has a bad reputation, you go to another with a good reputation. In the NHS, you don't have that choice, and the outcomes are clear. In the year before the pandemic, we had the second highest avoidable mortality rates in all of Western Europe. That is not a system I'm proud of, and it's not the individual doctors and nurses, it is the social system as a whole. So the NHS must be privatised.
I mean, look, with the NHS, I mean, I agree with scrapping NHS England, or the bureaucracy there. I think that's a good thing.
It's
But
crazy
no,
that we wouldn't even
to...
been able to have this conversation 10 years ago.
Really?
Because the NHS...
I don't know. I mean, I think you say that, but the NHS has always been, it's always been up for that sort of, that conversation.
I don't think so.
Really? I think under austerity, I mean, when you saw mail getting privatised and you saw other industries as well, it didn't seem, the NHS has slowly been privatised over the years, no?
It has not been privatised over the years. The government spend about £200 billion a year on the NHS.
Yeah, because they've had no choice, because when they've been inflicting austerity measures, in the end, because people aren't able to access, because they've had their welfare cut, means they are having to go to their local A&E. They're having to access NHS providers in order to access the support that they need. That's why that funding's gone there.
The NHS has not been privatised.
I'm not saying it's been fully privatised, but there are areas that have been privatised.
It has not been privatised at all. It is still owned and run by the government. Everything the NHS does is decided by government bureaucrats that often do not know what they're doing. We're spending about £200 billion a year on the National Health Service, and the more we spend, it's seemingly the less we get. I think the NHS is a bureaucratic black hole, and we've got to start thinking about whether or not it is worth funneling taxpayer money into a system that is not working for us. I mean, I think the Netherlands is a great example. The rest of Europe, basically the rest of Europe, have a competitive market in healthcare where patients choose, not government bureaucrats. And yet in the UK, we seem unable to really look at ourselves in the mirror and question why does the NHS not work despite record levels of spending?
But what you also have to remember about the Netherlands, for example, is that basically from a very young age, obviously it is a very small country. It's only 16 million people live there, 18 million, I believe. It's a very easy country to get around in terms of cycling, walking. The public transport is very good. People are encouraged to be healthy. Yeah. And I think obviously here in the UK, perhaps not the same. I don't know whether you still smoke. I am trying to quit this year. But I mean, there is that.
Don't ask me that question. It was my New Year's resolution to quit, but...
How's that going?
Well, I lasted about 6 days.
You make a great politician then. Can't keep promises. No, I think, I think, again, we do have to talk about, the lifestyles of people in this country and obviously the impact that has, of course. But again, going back to the Netherlands, I mean, they're not very happy with their government at the moment, but that's just the way that it's structured. I mean, we have seemed to have an election every couple of years, just because we feel like it. And obviously we've seen the problems there. But I mean, speaking with my own family within healthcare, it's okay, but I think
miles way better than the NHS.
Yeah, but also forget that it's a smaller country. I mean, the population of this country is what, 66?
Okay, what about Sweden, Denmark, Germany?
But also, when you mention these Scandinavian countries, they have a very strong welfare state.
They have lower taxes. I mean, Sweden is a fantastic example of this. People think that Sweden is some kind of, socialist utopia. It isn't. I mean, they've got lower taxes. They have no minimum wage. Sweden has no minimum wage laws.
But that's because unions are stronger in that country, which means they negotiate directly with their employers. Whereas in this country, basically trade unions have been clamped down on since the 80s.
Yeah.
And this is why I don't like this Labour government. One of the reasons I don't like this Labour government is because they aren't repealing anti-trade union laws. Trade unions help build this country to where it is. I mean, that needs to be celebrated.
I'm not against I think trade unions negotiating freely with employers is absolutely a fantastic thing. Crucially, the government must stay out of the way. And so I actually think what's fascinating about Sweden is it's a pretty free market economy. And actually a lot of the improvements in the Swedish economy have occurred during a period of lower taxes, less public spending. A lot of the improvements have occurred through that. And so what's interesting is the most egalitarian societies in this world have come about as a result of freedom. But going back
to the question,
economic liberty.
Okay, yeah. I love how we just didn't touch on the things there.
Statement number 4. Capitalism has done more good than harm in the UK.
Strongly agree.
I'm not surprised, I disagree.
Well, what do we mean by capitalism, I think, is the key point here. I would say that capitalism to be defined as the free market economy. That's what I mean when I talk about capitalism. Capitalism is the voluntary exchange of goods and services. So I have something, somebody else has something, I voluntarily choose to exchange that thing with one other person. So I think that capitalism is moral because it is a system based on consent. I consent to voluntary exchanging. And what I don't mean by capitalism is crony capitalism, is the government regulating businesses so that the incumbents are able to succeed and we don't have competition. What I mean by capitalism is freedom. It's choice. It's economic liberty. Do you want to define what you mean by capitalism?
To me, I see it as inherently exploitative. Again, I'm going to talk about privatization and the industries there. Again, when you look at energy providers, for example, people have no choice but to heat their homes. If they want to eat, they have to heat that. They have to provide the energy in order to do that. And we see how high energy bills are in this country.
That's because of net zero and the government's restrictions on fossil fuels. We've basically have a de facto ban on
So where do you stand on
fracking.
things like climate change, for example?
Well,
I guess you're...
What do you mean? What, about climate change specifically?
In terms of the harms that it's doing to this planet?
Well, absolutely. Climate change is absolutely a real phenomenon, and it is obviously human-made. But these solutions are not to make ourselves poorer in the next 10 years. These solutions are to ensure that we're able to become more energy efficient, nuclear power. The fact that Elon Musk wants to use X and SpaceX and all of his fantastic companies to create small modular nuclear reactors is amazing. And I think we should be encouraging that kind of private investment in cheaper and more energy efficient and more environmentally friendly energy sources. But the solution is not to reduce the amount of fracking that we're using, or even fossil fuels, because what we're doing then is reducing the supply of energy. So you're absolutely right.
But then fracking is an interesting, because it is harming the planet. Obviously, that's not something that we should be doing.
But we've got to find the replacement before we stop doing that.
But I think the replacement is obviously there, nuclear energy. I'm glad that we agree on that.
We agree on that.
Yeah.
Pro-nuclear.
Pro-nuclear, definitely. That's why I don't really like the Green Party in that respect. So, well, I am a member, but I don't like the...
Can we just talk about how insane it is that the Green Party are literally campaigning against the very solution to climate change?
I do hope they get out of that, because I think they will have no choice. Because again, everyone knows the Green Party obviously sees them traditionally as being the party for the environment, and nuclear energy is the best way of securing the planet's future.
And it's
so what we've seen is we've seen the Conservative government as well blocking, and obviously when Labour as well, blocking the development of nuclear power plants.
I totally hate NIMBYs.
Yeah, not in my backyard. That's what.
Not in my backyard. Yes, sorry, we should explain that. Yeah. So NIMBYs are. I feel like what's interesting about this conversation, by the way, is there seems to be more division in the young and the old versus the young right and the young left.
100%.
Because our areas of agreement have been traditionally policies that have basically been in place to win the votes of older pensioners.
Because as a demographic, they are they
vote.
Yeah, exactly.
They vote.
Yeah.
Young people don't vote, and therefore, when it comes to public spending measures, looking at the pension system, or indeed house building. Should we talk about house building? I mean, my God, the fact that we refuse to build more housing in order to pander to basically old age pensioners that own their own homes already is insane, and it is fundamentally a government problem. If we want lower energy bills, if we want lower house prices, lower rents, the solution is to increase supply. Increase supply, prices come down. And the reason why supply is not increasing, the reason why we're not building more homes, and the reason why energy isn't increasing is because of the government. And that is why I'm a libertarian.
How much longer have we got?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. But again, I mean, I do think it's very interesting. But I think, again, for our generation, we've obviously lived, our formative years were spent under the Conservative governments and austerity, and we saw, and it affected everyone in different ways. So, for example, I was SEN at school, and I saw how the provisions just simply were not there because the funding was not there, and that wasn't being provided. And I think, again, and when you look at YouGov polling, for example, the Labour Party and the Green Party are the parties most likely 18 to 24-year-olds are going to vote for. No longer in that category, unfortunately. But I'm still got it though. But it is. You are right in terms of that divide. But I think, again, for us, even though we have different views on different things, on the same things, we are kind of united in that idea that our generation in particular has been fucked over. I would argue that capitalism has played a part in that, in terms of the exploitation that has gone on.
It absolutely has.
I feel like we have been exploited.
We've been exploited by the government, by the state. I mean, let's talk about what this Labour government have done to jobs. We're now in a situation where 1 in 4 people that are working age, those between 16 and 64, are not in work. And a lot of it is due to the fact that those people have mental illnesses, partly depression and anxiety, and the government have made it extraordinarily easy to claim enormous amounts of benefits as a result of that.
How much is enormous amounts? Because
example is Amy, who was in a Channel 4 documentary that Fraser Nelson hosted. It was fantastic. And she was interviewed about this, and she's got a young child. And she said in order for her to be getting the same package that she was getting on benefits or is getting on benefits, she would need to be earning £40,000 a year after tax. Now, when you look at individual benefits, it's not very much. You know, universal credit itself is not very much. But when you add universal credit, personal independence payments for anxiety and depression, housing benefit, child benefit, you can be earning an enormous amount of money.
PIP is a very interesting thing because PIP is an in-work benefit, so you can receive it whilst you're working.
80% of PIP claimants are not in work.
But when we look at the fraud rate, for example, with PIP as well, it's pretty much non-existent. So people are genuinely struggling and need the support.
Last tax year, there were 6 people that claimed PIP for acne. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think people should be able to claim disability benefits for having acne.
Not necessarily, but then what other issues do those people have? Was it solely for acne? Or was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got acne, you've got ADHD, anxiety, depression. I mean, look, the problem is...
But all these conditions, what you think, everyone, obviously we're talking about mental illnesses, but people forget the physical toll that those conditions can take on your body. As someone who has suffered with anxiety and depression, I can tell you the physical response that those conditions have had on my body has been awful. I've been unable to walk sometimes. Now, thankfully, I have a very good support network, so I've never had to claim any welfare for it. But if I didn't have the support network that I did, I would perhaps have to.
I'm sorry that you've been through that.
It's okay.
And I would also say that the best thing for a person that is suffering from mental illness is not for them to be stuck at home. I think that work gives you structure, it gives you a reason to get up in the morning.
I completely agree, but then are those jobs for those people actually tailored for them? Are they suited?
So then let's talk about why I don't blame those people at all for claiming those benefits, because often the jobs don't exist. Let's talk about why. The government, this government...
Oh, okay.
The problem is the government.